So in Mark 131, we saw that Jesus healed the mother-in-law of Peter. And then all of a sudden, today, we're going to see Mark 132. There's a big jump because all of a sudden, tons of people knock on the door where Jesus is living, and they bring to him a lot of people that are sick so that Jesus could heal them. But how do they know about this? I mean, think about it. Jesus had just driven a demon out of a person in the synagogue in Capernaum, and then straight after that, he had gone to the house of Peter and Andrew and healed Peter's mother in law. But that was a private miracle that only his disciples saw. So, did really the voice about that demon possessed man healed in the synagogue spread out so quickly that now hundreds of people literally knew where Jesus was and they were bringing to him all these people? Or what else is going on here? Let's start reading Mark 132. Opsia de genomenes, hote eidu ho helios, eferon prosauton, pantas tus kakos ekontas, kai tus diamonizomenus. So let's start with the structure, the grammatical structure of the sentence. Now, the principal sentence is right here. This is the verb eferon. Okay, this is the verb that we need to keep in mind, where the subject is understood to be the people or a generic they. All right. And then the object of this verb is right here, pantas tus ekontas. Okay. This is the direct object. Okay. And within this object, you have this adverb, kakos, that specify what type of people these were. And this is the second object. Tus diamonizomenus is another object. So object number one and object number two. There were two type of people that were brought to Jesus. All right. Then you have these prepositional phrase pros auton with the preposition pros and the accusative case auton. And then you have these other two sentences here. All right. These other two clauses, opsia de genomenes and hote eidu ho helios, which tell us something about the timing of when this event occurred. All right. They tell us when. Okay. And specifically, hote. So two temporal indication, very specific. The second more specific than the first. The second put there just to specify exactly where exactly during the day this thing is happening. All right. So now that we have the general structure, grammatical structure of the sentence, let's try to translate. So let's start from these two dependent clauses. All right. Temporal clauses. Let's start from the first one. Opsia de genomenes. Now, this is a very specific, special Greek grammatical structure. If you see the case as, genomenes, these are genitive. All right. So these are genitive. In this particular case, is singular and feminine. Why? Because it refers to this term opsias, and opsia means evening. Okay, evening. So it's a feminine singular noun connected with a participle. Genomenes is a feminine singular participle. The verb we already seen it many times. Okay, is the verb to be. Okay, ginomai, the verb to be or the verb to become. Okay, so what is this particular structure? It's a genitive connected with a participle together that act as a genitive absolute. It's called genitive absolute. And it creates a sort of dependent clause that it's very similar to the ablative absolute that you have in Latin, that tells you something that is happening while something is happening. All right. So in this case, It's telling you that when or while evening was occurring, as it was becoming evening. That's the meaning. Okay, so we could translate it in many ways. During evening, all right, or as we were approaching evening. Now, there are many ways of understanding this, but the idea is that the sun was coming down, the light, it was getting darker, right? Or as it was getting darker, and so on. Um, the specific timing of this event, so the day getting toward evening and getting darker, is specified in the second clause. Now, why? Because opsia, which means evening in Greek, is a very broad term. Can be used sometimes to identify that period of time in the afternoon right before the sun goes down. So, roughly speaking, 3 to 6 p.m. Or it could also be that time right after the sun sets, before it gets pitch dark, right? From roughly 6 to 9 p.m. All right. So it's a very broad reference. Okay. It's basically when the day is getting to the end. All right. And that's why Mark uses this second clause introduced the um, by this hote, okay, which means when, okay, to specify exactly the moment in this big range from 3 to 9 p.m. And he says that this occurred while it was getting dark when ho helios, this is the subject of this dependent clause. So ho, as we know, is the definite article, the masculine singular that refers to the noun helios. Now, you probably know this means sun. Think about English words that start with the root helios, like heliocentric, right? Is that theory that puts the sun in the center of the solar system and so on. And so this means the sun, okay? And the verb edu comes from the verb duno, which means to set, all right? So you already understood what this means. When the sun set, when the sun was setting, okay? So as it was getting dark, when the sun set. So this is a very specific time reference. Mark wants us to understand that we are in that part of the evening where the sun has already set. And we're going to see that there is a reason why. If you just take this verse out of context and you read this, these two independent clauses, as evening was approaching when the sun was setting, you would say this is just a repetition. It's just a redundancy. Why is Mark specifying that? Of course, if it was evening, it was that time of the day when the sun was setting. There's no reason to specify that the sun is setting during evening. Everybody knows that. We're going to see that this is not a repetition. This is not a redundancy. Again, Mark uses and chooses his words and his sentences very wisely. And if there's no reason for him to add something, you be sure that he will not add something that is not necessary to the context. And so we're going to see why. There's a very important reason why Mark is specifying that it was not just evening, it was that part of the evening when the sun set. All right, let's move on with the rest of the sentence. We already said that the subject is understood to be a generic they, and the verb is epheron. Now, let's spend some time on this verb. This is an imperfect, all right? Imperfect. That indicates a continuous action in the past, all right? The verb is a very common verb, is the verb fero, okay? It's a verb that it's also, you'll find in Latin, exactly the same, fero, which means to bring, okay? To bring. This is a very common verb. And There are two verbs in Greek that indicates the idea of leading something. Now, one is ago, all right, ago, which means to lead, all right, like that. And the other is phero, which means to bring. The difference between two verbs that sometimes are used interchangeably is that ago is usually associated with people. So you lead a person because you usually go with that person, together with that person, and that person follows you. That's ago. The verb phero instead is used for things more than anything else. It's because you are carrying something. So the verb to phero is more bring in the sense of carrying. Okay, you're carrying a package, you're carrying a heavy thing, you're putting some effort in carrying in your hands. Okay, and so pay attention to the use of this. Okay, Mark here is not using the verb ago, he's using the verb phero, which means to bring in the sense of transporting or carrying. Why? Well, we're going to see it right now because they were bringing to Jesus sick people. Okay. So these sick people were not just following them because they were not able to walk. There were people that were lying down on stretches. There were paralytics that couldn't even move. All right. Or there were people demon possessed. So they have to drag them or they have to carry them physically. All right. So that's how specific Mark is in the use of his verbs. All right. So they were bringing pros auton. Pros, we've seen it many times, is a preposition that indicates emotion toward. Okay. And it wants the accusative after it. And in fact, you're going to see the accusative case here, auton. This is a personal pronoun. We've seen it many times in the masculine singular. So it means him. Okay. Toward him, to him. They were bringing to him, to Jesus, of course, who? Pantas tous ichontas. Okay, and we're going to leave this kakos alone for now. So, pantas is a very common adjective in Greek, which means all. Okay, all. Think about verb pantheon. Pantheon is a temple dedicated to all the gods, right? So pantas means all, and it's in the accusative case, masculine plural, all right? As we see here, tous is the, all the, again, masculine plural accusative, together with akontas. What is this akontas? This is a participle, another participle, masculine plural accusative of the verb echo. Now, the verb echo means to have, literally. Okay, so it's one of the most common verbs in Greek, to have. And this adverb kakos means bad. All right, so what's the meaning of this whole phrase? They were bringing to Jesus whom? All that, all those that were having bad. That's literally what it means. All right. So it simply means all those that were doing bad, all those that were sick. All right. All those that had some kind of sickness. But this is the literal meaning of the phrase. Right. So as during evening, when the sun set, they would bring to him all those that were sick, we could translate, or were not feeling well, or that they were feeling bad. All right. And Kai, another type of people. So remember, this is the first type of people that we're bringing, all the people with all the type of sickness you can ever imagine. And the second type of people, distinguished from this first group, is defined by tous diamonizomenos. Now, again, this tous means the, right, is the definite article, masculine plural in the accusative case. And now we have this other participle, all right, diamonizomenos, which is in the, you see in this menus ending, it's in the passive form, all right? It's in the passive form. Why? Because the verb diamonizo as you can guess, means or diamonizomai in the passive means to be possessed by a demon. Okay, daimon is the root for demon. All right, so these were the people that were possessed by a demon. All right, so if we put everything together, we could translate this verse as the day was getting dark, when the sun set or was setting, they would bring to him all that were feeling sick and those that were possessed by a demon. Now there's still two questions that we need to answer. So the first one is, how in the world all these people know about Jesus? Okay, because if we just read Mark, we know that Jesus picked his four disciples, Peter, Andrew, John, and James, and then soon after he went into Capernaum, into the synagogue. He was teaching there. He drove a demon out. Soon after, got out, went straight to the house of Peter, healed the mother-in-law of Peter, and then that very night, all of a sudden, all these people coming from everywhere, bringing sick and demon possessed to him to be healed. How in the world did they know about Jesus? Well, if we just read Mark, we're not going to understand that. To respond to this question and make sense of this, we need to put Mark into the context of the Synoptic Gospel. So we need to look at Mark together with Luke, together with especially Matthew. All right. So if we look at Luke, okay, we're going to know something. Luke says that before all these things happened, Jesus had gone to Nazareth. So before teaching in Capernaum, he had gone back to Nazareth, to his own town. That makes a lot of sense, right? Jesus, to start his public ministry, the first thing he does is just go to his own synagogue, all right, in Nazareth. And we know from Luke that he was rejected. And from there, he decides to, okay, you reject me here, so let me move on to a larger region, which was Galilee. That's why he moves to Capernaum. So we know that he has already been teaching around for a while. But this still does not explain this passage in Mark. To understand that, we need to go to Matthew. All right. So the structure of the Gospel of Matthew, we know that Matthew and Mark are 90% overlapping, and meaning that basically 90% of the material that you find in Mark, you're going to also find in Matthew. All right. So what you're going to see is that both Mark and Matthew follow Jesus during his baptism from John the Baptist, then the temptation in the desert, in the wilderness. Then they both tell us that Jesus called the first four disciples. But then there's a disconnect, because Mark, after that, immediately jumps to Jesus being in Capernaum, driving out the demon, then going to Peter's house, healing his mother-in-law, and then all these other people coming and bringing sick people to him to be healed. In Matthew is much slower. What we see at the end of chapter 4 in Matthew is that Jesus, yes, calls his first disciples, and then he starts preaching throughout Galilee. And Matthew says that he started going around Galilee, preaching in their synagogues, healing a lot of people. All right. Now, Matthew, at the end of chapter 4, stops his narration for 3 whole chapters. Chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7 in Matthew are going to be completely dedicated to the Sermon on the Mount. So all of a sudden, Jesus is on the mountain. He goes up the mountain and he gives this beautiful speech, okay, out of nowhere. All right. And then in chapter 8, Matthew goes back to the end of chapter 4, where he was saying that Jesus was teaching in their synagogue, to try to go back to the narration, okay, and show how he kept on healing people, and then he healed the centurion, and then all of a sudden in Matthew, the mother-in-law of Peter pops up, And all of a sudden, we see Jesus entering Peter's house and healing his mother in law. All right. So now we have much more context. From Matthew, we know that from the time that Jesus called his first four disciples to the time that he healed his mother in law, it was not the same day. Okay. It was not even the day after. There was a lot of time passing by. All right. There was a whole speech on the mountain. All right. And possibly there were weeks where he spent around Galilee, around the synagogues in Galilee, to preach the repentance, the coming of the kingdom of heaven, and healing people. So now we understand Mark 1:32, right? When Mark says people from everywhere were bringing to him people to be healed. Well, now we understand it's because actually he had already healed a lot of people before. Okay, remember, Mark is narrating his gospel based on the gospel of Peter. Mark was traveling together with Peter, and he was his interpreter. So he remembers the stories from Peter's mouth, but he was not an eyewitness, and he didn't have a clear idea of the correct time succession, okay, of events. All right. So in Matthew's gospel, in Mark's gospel, we're gonna find places where there's like blanks, right, and just the next episode doesn't really connect with the previous one. But if we put it in context with the other synoptic gospel, we're gonna have a very clear picture of what's going on. All right. So this is the first thing. The second question that we need to still answer is why in the world Mark spent so much time telling us that not only was evening, but it was that part of the evening when the sun had set. All right, to understand this becomes a little fishy here. We need to put together Mark again with the same episode narrated in Matthew and Luke. So let's try to do that and let's try to understand what's going on here. So there are four passages that we have to consider from a synoptical point of view. Okay, so we start with our Mark 1:32, which is what we're looking at right now, and we see that it has a connection in two passages in Matthew chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 8, and also Luke chapter 4. All right. We see clear connections here. So let's start from Matthew chapter 4. As I said before, this is the end of chapter 4 in Matthew, right before the start of the Sermon on the Mount, where Matthew says that Jesus started preaching in Galilee, throughout all the synagogues in Galilee, and he started healing a lot of people. And what Matthew says is that pros enenkan, meaning they brought to him auto, is exactly the same expression as here in Mark 1:32 that we saw before. Epheron pros auton. The verb is the same, phero. Here is conjugated in Mark in the imperfect tense. In Matthew, it's conjugated in the aorist tense, but it's exactly the same verb. You see the preposition pros that in Mark is used after the verb, in Matthew is used before the verb, but the expression is the same. Prosenenkan auton, they would bring to him, look, pantas tous kakos ekantas, exactly the same expression used by Mark. Pantas tous kakos ekantas. Everybody that was feeling sick. Okay, so there's definitely a connection between Mark 1:32 and Matthew 4:24 in terms of this expression that people were bringing to Jesus all that were sick. Now, we saw that Matthew stops the narration at the end of chapter 4, and then it dedicates the next three chapters, 5, 6, and 7, to the Sermon on the Mount. And then starting chapter 8, and we get here, he basically goes back to chapter 4 and start the narration again. And look how he starts. He says, Opsias de Genomenes. Does that ring a bell? Yes, it's exactly Mark 1:32. Opsias de Genomenes. All right? So it's exactly the same expression. When it was evening, okay? Or as the evening was approaching, or as it was getting dark, okay? So we see already two equal expression used by Matthew from Mark 132 in two different passages of his gospel. At the end of chapter 4 and then in the beginning of chapter 8, in the middle there is the big Sermon on the Mount. Now, let's turn to Luke. Okay. Well, let's spend some time also on Matthew. What does he say in Matthew here? Prosenenkan, okay, which is, by the way, the same verb used here. Look at that. Prosenenkan. They will bring to him, prosenenkan auto, who? Diamonizomenus polus. Polus means many that were possessed by demons. So it looks like that Matthew just took Mark 132 and he completely split it up in two pieces. One at the end of chapter 4 and the other at the beginning of chapter 8, and in the middle he put the big Sermon on the Mount. At the end of chapter 4 he just talks generally about all the people that were feeling sick, and then at the beginning of chapter 8 he talks about those that were being possessed, which is right here, diamonizomenus, okay, same expression. All right, so we have this splitting of Matthew of the same passage of Mark in two different chapters of his gospel. Now let's turn to Luke. Very interesting. Look how he starts. Duontos de tu heliu. Again, does this ring a bell? Look at here. Hote edu ho helios. When the sun set. Well, look, it exactly uses the same expression, but in the genitive absolute. So it kind of copies Mark in the fact that he starts the phrase using a genitive absolute, but it's kind of translating Mark second clause into genitive absolute with the same verb. The verb is duno, we saw it before, means setting, and the subject is helios, which is the sun. But you see that it's conjugated in the genitive, to heliu, okay? Duonto, it's all in the genitive. But the meaning is exactly the same, as the sun was setting, all right? As the sun was setting. And then look, changed a little bit. But the meaning is the same, right? He's basically saying that all that were sick or weak for many sicknesses, they were brought to him, and that's what basically Luke is saying. So the general meaning of the passage is the same, but you see the complexity of the synoptic problem, right? You have the same passage that is narrated by Mark, by Luke, and by Matthew in two different places of his gospel. But it's very clear that everything comes back to the same material. Now, one thing, this still does not answer our question, which is why does Mark only, put this emphasis with this double clause, when it was evening and when the sun set? Okay, why does Mark use this kind of repetition? Now, there are different theories here. Those that believe that Mark wrote after Matthew and also Luke, so they believe in the theory that the first gospel ever written was Matthew, and then Luke, and they put Mark third. They say this is a clear evidence that Mark used Matthew and Luke to write his gospel. Why? Because they're saying Mark is just taking Matthew 8:16 and then Luke 4:44 and combining them together. And so it takes the first clause, opsia de genomenes, from Matthew, and he puts it here. And then he takes the second clause from Luke, duontos de tu Eliu. But of course, since you cannot, it's not stylistically good to put two genitive absolute one after the other. It just uses a more explicit clause with a hote, when. But it's basically the same. And so they're saying Matthew is just trying to conflating both Luke and Matthew. And so he uses the first clause for Matthew, the first clause from Luke, and it becomes two clauses. And yeah, it's redundant, but that's the proof that Mark is using both Luke and Matthew. Well, this is a theory, and one argument is that supporting this theory is that, well, if you believe that instead Mark was written first, then you have to assume that Luke picked out of the two. So Luke was reviewing, let's say, Mark Gospel. He saw that there was a redundancy and decided to go with only one of the two clauses. And so Luke, it seems like, picked the second clause, right, that the sun was setting, while Matthew picked the first clause when it was evening. And so they're saying it cannot be a coincidence that whatever Luke chose, Matthew didn't. Okay. And they're saying there are many other examples like that. So it cannot be a coincidence that Luke and Matthew are completely complementary. All right. And so this is, according to whoever support this theory, is a strong evidence that actually Mark used both Matthew and Luke, and it's not that Luke and Matthew used Mark. Well, I'm definitely not a synoptic expert, and I don't want to spend definitely too much time on this because I don't think it's even a problem, and the problem is way too big. It's way too hard to disentangle. Scholars have been debating this for years and years and years, and some of them concluded that the synoptic problem, meaning understanding who really wrote first and who copied from whom, is basically impossible to solve. It's too complicated, right? So we don't want to enter definitely here, but definitely in this particular case, at least, we can definitely find some reason to still believe that Mark could possibly be the first gospel written here. Not necessarily based on this, we need to conclude that Mark wrote after Matthew and Luke. One thing is, well, is it really a redundancy saying when it was evening, when the sun set? Well, if you say it in general, yes, it sounds like a redundancy. Of course, in the evening, the sun is setting. But if you put this into context, you probably have a good, reasonable way of explaining, one, why Mark uses both, why Luke decides to just use one and picks the second one, and why Matthew actually picks the first one. So this is my 2 cents here. Now, Mark wants to be as specific as possible. So he starts setting the problem. It's evening. But then he realized that this is not enough because he wants to make another point. It was after the sun set. Why? Because it was a Sabbath. Remember, Jesus went to preach in the synagogue on a Sabbath. He drove that spirit, unclean spirit, out of that man. And then on the same Sabbath, he went to the house of Peter and Andrew. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. And then the night, the same evening of the same Sabbath, that's when they started bringing people to them. Now everything starts making sense. Why were people taking all these sick people and possessed to Jesus at night? Well, because it was a Sabbath. And they couldn't have done it during the day because remember, the Sabbath was a day of rest. They couldn't perform any work. And remember the verb epheron means transporting, bringing and transporting something was considered a work. You couldn't do that during a Sabbath. All right. So you needed to wait for the Sabbath to finish. And remember, in the Jewish culture, the day ends when the sun sets. So when the sun sets, it's not the Sabbath anymore. It's already the next day. It's the first day of the week. All right. So it becomes absolutely clear and reasonable why Mark wants to make this very specific, wants to make this very specific remark, because he wants to us to understand that they started bringing people there, not during the day, but after the sun set, because they were respecting the Sabbath. They were just waiting for the Sabbath to be finished to be able to transport all these people to him. And Luke agrees with Mark and chooses to not just say that it was evening, but he wants to stress the fact that the sun, to Heliu duontos, had set or was setting. Okay, why? Because Luke again refers to the fact that Jesus was teaching in the synagogue right before this episode on a Sabbath day. So both in Mark and in Luke, it's pretty clear that these actions, these two events of people bringing all sick and demon possessed people to him, happened on a Sabbath. Okay. Well, if you go to Matthew and you read the Matthew Gospel, well, this first reference at the end of chapter 4 is very general. And it seems like a summary where Matthew says, Jesus went around Galilee, he was preaching, and people where he was healing a lot of people, and people were bringing all the sick and people possessed to him. So it's a very general statement. It's not a specific episode happened occurring on a particular day, specifically the Sabbath. The same thing if you go and read chapter 8, that episode of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, and soon after people bringing to him sick and demonized, it's completely out of nowhere. It's not, there's no context there. It's not occurring in any particular day. If you read Matthew, you don't understand that it's a Sabbath. And so it's pretty easy to understand why Matthew doesn't feel compelled to say that it was when the sun set, because he's not relating this episode to a Sabbath. And you have to think about it. Matthew is not an eyewitness of this particular episode. Matthew is not an eyewitness of this particular episode. Okay, according to the gospel, Matthew was called by Jesus later on. Okay, so Matthew must have learned and heard about this episode of Jesus, healing Peter's mother-in-law, and then people bringing to him that night, all these sick people and demonized, probably from Peter or from Andy or John or James, the first disciples. Okay, so it's also likely that Matthew didn't know that this episode happened on the Sabbath. Okay, and so there's no reason for him to specify that the sun set. For Matthew, it was absolutely enough to just mention that it was during the evening. But if you read Matthew, it's not really clear why in the evening. Why are people waiting the night, the sun setting, to bring all these people to him? It's not clear. But if you read Mark and Luke, it's absolutely clear. It's because it was